Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story. It is Friday, our last day talking about the book of Hosea. I'm with Alyssa Bream and Chris Rexroad, and we're in Hosea 12 today. And it begins by saying, the people of Israel feed on the wind. They chase after the east wind all day long. They pile up lies and violence. They are making an alliance with Assyria while sending olive oil to buy support from Egypt. Now the Lord is bringing charges against Judah. He is about to punish Jacob for all his deceitful ways and even pay him back for all he has done. Even in the womb, Jacob struggled with his brother. When he became a man, he even fought with God. So it retells kind of the story of Jacob and his wrestling with God. It says, he wrestled with an angel and won. He wept and pleaded for a blessing from him. There at Bethel, he met God face to face, and God spoke to him. I'm always fascinated by that particular wrestling match and the fact that it says he won. Either he was a bad dude or the angel let him win or was fixed fight. I'm not sure, all of the above.
But didn't he walk with a limp?
His hip.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
All right. So he won in some ways, but in other ways,
he was marked.
Yeah, he was marked.
Yeah, he was like Mick Foley after he fell through the cage.
You got your wrestling, I have the office.
Yeah, I know too much about wrestling, unfortunately. I think all of us at different times in our walk have wrestling matches with God. The question that I want to talk about today are, what are some of the wrestling matches that most people have? What are the common ones that you think people have to really work through? Like, this is trying to, I don't know if it's a negotiation, a coming face to face with God. Finally, I don't know. What are some common wrestling matches? I'll give you one that I've seen in my own life, and it is one that I'm often approached with. It is decisions that are not right and wrong. Should I take this job? Should I stay here? Mm-hmm. Should I do this? The time that there have been lots of times in my life I felt like I was wrestling, and it would be very difficult for me to say I was wrestling with God, even though maybe that's what it was. Maybe I was wrestling with myself. I certainly was wrestling with a decision. I had been attending church here. I had gone to preach at a church that needed a pastor. I'd been there for a few months and they wanted me to stay as pastor. And then the pastor here at this church asked me would I stay and come on staff. And I suddenly had a decision to make. And it was a real wrestling match for me, just a real challenging time. And looking back on it, there were things that I see and understand a little better today. But I think when people have trying to discern God's will when it's not right and wrong, or we have a desire, we have what we believe might be best, mm-hmm. and God has what He believes might be best, and it's a real wrestling match. That is a common thing for people to come to me with. How do I make this decision? I'm really. They'll use that's often how they describe it. I'm really wrestling with this. So maybe you have an example of wrestling through a decision, or maybe you could offer some insight on some other ways that people wrestle with God.
It's common when you're in your Christian walk, especially coming to church and everything, that sometimes God wants to pull you in a direction to either serve or be a part of something that causes you to give up some of your time, finances, or whatever. And He pulls you in that direction, and it can be a very common time to kind of struggle with that or wrestle with it if you want to be able to, like, if you want to give up something to put that into your calendar, your finances, serving in different places. I think those are some common things for people, specifically in church. Um, and I'm not exempt from that. I've had plenty of wrestling matches with God mentally in my walk, and one specifically was actually transitioning from my previous career as a CNC machinist, where things were very secure. Um, Money was good. I mean, it was skilled labor and good work environment and everything. And I felt God calling me into ministry, and I didn't come from a ministry family or anything like that, so that was very foreign to me, and I knew it was a huge life change. Um, and I wrestled with that for probably 2 years before I actually committed to doing online college while I was still working. Um, and he won.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the times, if there's a couple things in front of you and it's kind of in that gray area you're talking about, not right and wrong, sometimes the answer God's giving you is pick whichever one you want, and I'll bless that. Just work in that as though you're working for me.
So I'm gonna before you speak, I want to ask you a question because something crossed my mind as you were talking. You used the phrase "he won,"
Mm-hmm.
and I've asked myself the question, um, how did Jacob win against God? In the end, are you not the one that won? In that you are the one that is fulfilled and at peace because you came to that conclusion. And I'm not saying God didn't win.
Yeah.
I just saw it maybe a different way when you said it.
I guess I'd put it as though more of an earthly reference that
Mm-hmm.
if I was in an argument with my dad and he was clearly right, and I finally submitted to what he said and did it and found out that he was right, I'm being blessed by him being right. So I guess that's the kind of way I'm looking at it. But yeah, I think God and Jacob won in that situation, and I think that's what happens when we obey and follow God into the areas that we're not real familiar with and trust Him.
I do think a lot of the wrestling that maybe I've had in my life is like you kind of mentioned, like almost the wrestling with yourself, or maybe there wasn't like a right decision. There's different decisions, like, but not necessarily a right one, but you feel like there should be a right one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there was in college, everyone that was going, or a lot of people that I went to college with were looking towards full-time ministry. And whenever you do that, it's like, where is God calling me to? What is it? And that kind of that season of life gets really anxious when you don't know exactly what God is calling you to. And there was a book that we read, I want to say it was maybe our senior year. It's like, you know what? The will of God is more like a playground than a blueprint. And I know we've discussed this before in the podcast, but it kind of gave a little bit of freedom there. I think the things that maybe I have wrestled with God with is more about the tough relationships I've had with people where it's like we've talked about the forgiveness issues. I think those tough relationships sometimes of like treating people right and kind of like God, I don't want to treat them right. I want to give them what they deserve. I think that that's a wrestling match that I've had with God where obviously that one I should lose and I have lost. I think, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that story with wrestling with God is, I just went back and reread it and he loses, but he also wins. And I think that whenever we wrestle with God, you know, we can win because we went through that situation with God and we came to the other side.
Okay.
That's the winning.
I think the struggle I have in those situations is when I get it wrong. You know, I tell people sometimes when you're making a decision between two good things, um, the process is the win, not necessarily the choice. You know, that I'm if I have a tough decision to make, I'm praying more, I'm seeking wise counsel from people, I'm being deliberate. And often in those situations, doesn't matter what I choose. I'm closer to God because I've gone through the process than had I not gone through the process. You know, now there have been some things that I've wrestled with that I don't think were right or wrong issues, but they were clearly things God was trying to get me to give up because they had way too much of my time and attention. There was there was a particular game I loved to play online, and it it was just taking a lot of my time and attention. And I'm not a gamer by any stretch, but I remember, the whole wrestling match spiritually. I was going through, this.
It was Roblox, wasn't it?
No,
I'm just kidding.
definitely, no, definitely not. I think that sometimes the wrestling match is between what's distracting us from what God wants us to do and what we need to be focusing on. I went through a similar situation with my business. We still own a piece of the business, but the retail portion of it, I felt very clearly in 2014. I was standing beside the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Galilee, which we just recently visited, and St. Peter's Basilica, I think is what it's called, is there, where they said Jesus would have met Peter and, told him to go feed his sheep. I felt very clearly. I remember sitting at dinner with Jay and Troy and our wives and telling them what I felt like God had spoken to me, while I was there. But it was the end of 2020 before I knew, it was 6 years later before I ever moved on. And some of it maybe was God's timing. I don't know. I don't have all of the answers to that. But I think that sometimes it is just things God's trying to get us to do, and we wrestle. And the question I have is, God, did I miss something during that 6 years that you wanted me to do? I can certainly look back and see some distractions, some times that my focus wasn't what it needed to be, because I was torn in other places. And so I think sometimes those wrestling matches are things that either bring us security, like your job. They bring us comfort. It might be like a game or, whatever, food, I think that those wrestling matches are just as difficult and maybe even more challenging than some of the other sin issues. I don't know. Do you think people wrestle over right and wrong very much?
With sin?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Just thinking of examples. I mean, like when you're starting off in the young adult world, teenage world, and what we live in right now, as far as what God says about relationships, sexual relationships, living together, and all that kind of stuff, and then what the culture around us for decades now has been comfortable with, that marriage is just something that you do if it works out, that you can tolerate to live with each other and see how this relationship works out, and then we'll get married. So there's probably like 20 different things just within that people between the ages of 15 and 30 regularly battle with.
Do you think that this story made it into Hosea's writings because it was tough for him to make that decision to marry? Gomer? I don't know, because we see we didn't talk about the first chapter, but it says, go marry a prostitute. And then the next chapter is, so Hosea married Gomer. And so we don't get that, but it's almost like this made it in because maybe there was that wrestling match of, God, why are you calling me to this? I don't know.
I can't believe it was easy.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe that it was easy because...
At first, I mean, who's going to believe him? I mean, he's supposed to be a believable
prostitution
person.
has never been an esteemed profession.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's the oldest profession, but in Scripture it's not. There's a reason why when it says, Rahab was a prostitute, it's trying to tell you something. Now, they may have had more prominent places in town. Obviously, we had temple prostitutes, at times. But I don't know. That's that's good insight.
I wonder how much time passed in that one chapter.
In that one verse. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then this is the thing that struck me about that first chapter and all these three kids. This was pre-DNA. To never know if those were really his kids or not, and that he was raising them. And right?
Yeah.
I mean that
before Maury.
Right before you are not the father.
And their names.
Yes, the names.
The meaning of their names, like, man.
Yeah, I mean, man, I know that Barbara gets used a lot as an illustration, but like to have your whole life be a sermon illustration. Mm-hmm. I don't know. She shared something on Facebook stories about how she's always used.
Yeah.
But like your whole life being a sermon illustration, and you know that that's what it is. Man, that just, I don't know. That reading that and then thinking about
I'm marrying you, so I've got sermon material.
So, man, I don't know. Reading that first chapter, I mean, it had to be a wrestling match at times, maybe when the kids as teenagers made him mad. Well, maybe I'm not even your dad. I don't know. I don't know.
I heard a comedian one time. This is terrible, but we've got to close the podcast. That's a bad way to close it, but anyway, Here we go. He said he married his wife, had kids, and they weren't his, and he was getting on this. He kept getting on this one kid, and every time he did, the kid would just lose his cool. You're not my real dad, and I don't have to listen to you. And so one weekend, the kid came to him and asked him for some money, and he said sure. So he went and got some Monopoly money and took it into it. He said, "This ain't real money." He said, "Well, I'm not your real dad."
You're right. That's a horrible way to end this podcast.
It is. Oh. But I do think that had to be a wrestling match. That what do I do? How do I mean, it wasn't just once. He had to go back and redeem her a second time too. Mm-hmm. And the movie Redeeming Love, you said it's streaming free on Peacock. Maybe, hopefully, by the time they listen to this, it still will be. That is the tension in the movie for me, to watch him have to go back and redeem his wife again, because I don't know how I would respond. Mm-hmm. I just don't know. I don't even know how. Forget the redeeming part. I don't know how I would start. I don't even know how it would begin. And so it had to be, you have to believe that God was asking him to do a difficult thing. And he didn't just say, sure, God, whatever. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe one day we'll get to ask him. Yeah. Yep. Well, thank you for joining us this week on One Single Story. We hope that you will be back with us on Monday as we continue our conversation about another book of the Bible.